I'm excited to talk to you today about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is helping people to unleash the power of serverless functions with Nuxt. For those who don't know me, here's a little bit about what I do. I'm a staff developer experience engineer at Netlify, a Vue core team member, Nuxt ambassador, as well as a Google developer expert. But enough about me, let's jump into the meat of it, which is the idea of what serverless is. Serverless can be confusing for those kind of just getting started with it because it's about the fact that someone else is managing it. You're not the one starting it up, trying to scale it or maintain it. You're simply leveraging the benefits so that you can focus on the business problems that need solving for your customers. That said, of course, the question is, well, that's nice and all, but why should we bother with serverless functions? Well, I don't know about you, but especially as a front-end developer, there's a lot of times where I'm trying to get something from the back end and there's something I might want to customize, or maybe I have an idea on how I can make things better. But when it comes time to pitching something, well, it's, a bit like, denied. Well, here's the thing. What if you could build your own APIs that sit in the middle between what the backend is giving you and while also interfacing with what you have on the front end code? Now, some of you are probably thinking, wait, Ben, but I already have enough to learn. Serverless functions seems to have a pretty steep learning curve. There's something about AWS and I got to learn about Lambda functions. And how do I spin up an environment? And then I have to figure out how they talk. I know. It's a lot. But what if it didn't have to be so hard? Let's go ahead and start by breaking down what serverless functions are at its core. And so here we have a serverless function.js. So let's go ahead and break this down. Let's start with the exports. When you're looking at this might look a little weird, but the thing to remember here is that when you're writing serverless functions, you are writing JavaScript that's running on the server. So in other words, you're not in the client, you're not in the browser, you're actually in a node server. So the syntax here for exporting is a little bit different in that we have this exports.handler rather than the ES6 that most of you are probably familiar with. But so that's a little bit of a change, but from there, what do we have? Well, we assign the handler an async function. And the async is important here because just like the other APIs, your serverless functions also should be async. Finally, like any other HTTP call that you might make to an API, you actually need to return a response. And in the response, it's basically an object that contains a couple properties. And so two key ones you'll most commonly be using are the status code as well as the body. And believe it or not, that's all it takes to write a serverless function. Now that we've seen what serverless functions really consist of, it's time to show you what it looks like in a real code base. So jumping right in, what we have here is a Canto Pokedex, and what it's doing is it's calling the Poke API in order to fetch all of the information that's coming down. Inside of our homepage, we have a reactive data property for Pokedex, and then when the page is actually created, it'll go ahead and actually fetch from the Pokedex. And then in addition, because the original response within the Pokedex doesn't actually contain links to the images, we have to make a second call in order to modify the original response so that it comes back in one piece, right? So this is already a small example of how we tend to, on the front end, hack together those APIs in order to work the way we want it to. We don't want to have to separate this call out. We want one object that comes back with all the data that we need. But here's the thing, right? Is that one of the problems with this is that we're doing a lot of work on the client side. We're waiting for the client to actually, when it's created, to not only do the fetching, but then to take that information, process it, and then return it in a way that we like before we actually even do anything to the UI. And so really, if we think about it from an ideal front-end developer workflow, what do we actually really want? Well, we just really want to fetch from an endpoint, let's call it /API/Pokedex, and then assign it to Pokedex. That's all we want to do. So let's go ahead and show how this would work within the serverless context. To get started using serverless functions, the easiest way is we're going to leverage the Netlify CLI because it's going to abstract a lot of the configuration and setup that we typically have to do and make it really easy for us to work with it in our native dev environment. And so you can see here inside of our site that we have a netlify.toml to indicate that we basically have everything set up for Netlify. And most importantly for this talk, we declare that the functions will live inside of a folder for Netlify functions. And so here you see that it's created here with Netlify functions, and we even have our hello world right here. Now, how do we combine this with our Nuxt app? Well, since we're using Netlify CLI, what we can run is Netlify dev. And what that's going to do is actually going to set everything up as far as setting up a backend server with the API calls, proxying everything, and actually also simultaneously running our Nuxt app so that we can basically have them talk to each other without dealing with cores and all that stuff. And so you can see now that something's actually changed, right? For our Pokedex, instead of running at port 3000, which is the default for Nuxt, we now have port 8888. And so what's really cool about this now is check this out. If I go to /netlify/function/hello world, you'll see that I actually see the response that's written inside of here. And so if I change this right now to be like new more serverless and I save this, it'll actually go ahead and hot module reload that. You'll see actually here, it reloaded the function. And when I refresh this, you'll see that our server actually has basically updated like hot module reloading, which is really great. So let's go ahead and implement what we wanted to do. In our perfect world, we said what we want to do is we have a Pokedex endpoint. So what I'm going to do is create a new file called Pokedex, because this is what we're going to hit, Pokedex.js. And we'll do the exports handler, and it'll be an async function. And inside of here, we're going to actually just copy over everything we just did from here. And I'll just copy this whole constant for Pokedex. We'll drop it in here. And then what we're going to do is going to make sure we return a response. So I'm going to return a response. Whoops. So what we got to do is return a response, right? So we're going to return a response code of 200. And then with the body, we're going to JSON.stringify our Pokedex. The thing we have to do, though, before we go ahead and do this is remember that right now, serverless functions are working within the node context. So what this means is that the fetch API is not available via the browser like we're used to on the client side. So what we need to do real quick is we need to add a dependency. And so I've already installed this for the sake of this demo. But basically, we'll say that const fetch equals required node fetch. And so once we save that, we should now be able to actually test this out by going to Pokedex function, by going to our Netlify function /Pokedex. And you'll see that we actually get the response back exactly as we expected. And so if we go back into here, let's see how this would work in practice. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this. And then I'll leave the JSON because we're going to need to JSONify this. And then we just do /.netlify/function/Pokedex. And then if I save this now, there you go. Everything should be good. Now I'm going to go ahead and let's get out of this endpoint. Just go right back to home. And once I refresh, you'll see that everything actually works exactly as we expect. And the beautiful thing about this now is that we've offloaded all those computations onto the serverless function rather than doing it directly on our client side. And so the one final piece we want to do, the final piece I want to do for this demo is to show you that right now, as we can see, this part here is a little bit ugly, right? The /.netlify/functions, we really want it to be /API. So how can we go ahead and make this work? Well, it's actually as simple as going into our Netlify TOML, and then we're basically going to create a redirect and say that, look, when we get a specific pattern, we're going to want to make sure that it routes to the right place. And so in here, we're going to go ahead and say that whenever we call /API, we want to go ahead and redirect it into our serverless function. So this is where this comes in. And then to show the wildcard, we just use the :splat. That's the syntax for it. And so once we save, now you'll notice actually too, is that it'll actually, Netlify CLI automatically reloads your TOML for you. So again, is that kind of got that hot module reload thing going on, which is awesome. And so now, when I go ahead and switch this over, let's break it first, right? So I'll say API v2 and I save. This should just break. And so good, everything's broken. And then to show you it works, I'm gonna go ahead and make sure this is APIs. And then we'll delete the functions and save. And now when I refresh, check it out. It works just like that. And so there's so much more that we certainly could do with this, right? Because now that you've offloaded this logic into your serverless functions, you now have the ability to do things like customize the response even further. So maybe in the future, it's like refactoring the data so that it actually capitalizes the string in advance for us so that we don't even need to do it on the front end. So to wrap things up, tools like Netlify CLI, which allow you to work with serverless functions the way you would be normally used to working when you're working with your UI, that to me is the critical piece of infrastructure that makes all the difference to making serverless functions that much more accessible to developers. And so at the end of the day, really to me, serverless functions provide developers with superpowers to really have the freedom and flexibility to start architecting their solutions in ways that make the most sense for them without worrying about being limited. Of course, this is a 10-minute talk and there's only so much I can cover, but in case you didn't know, I have a course on Jamstack Explorers, which is a free video course platform from Netlify. And in here, I get you up and running with serverless functions in less than 30 minutes. And so the best part about this is you don't need any framework. And with that, thanks everyone for spending this time with me. If you're looking for me on the Internet of Things or have any questions, I'm basically under the moniker BenCodeZen under all the things. So there's like my Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch. With that said, thanks again, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.